What are mixing and mastering? Mixing and mastering are two of the three stages of audio production. The first of those stages is the tracking stage, we'll call it. That's actually the creation stage for your audio production. That might mean recording instruments. It might mean creating loops. It might mean creating beats. It might mean using synthesizers to play tracks, singing vocals, all those kind of things that go into actually creating the music. Now for me, I also consider editing tracks to be part of that whole creation stage, or the tracking stage, if you will. You might work on the arrangement here. You might clean up tracks, do all those sorts of processing things. And this is all to get your project ready to move into the second stage, which is the mixing stage. The mixing stage is where we take all of that audio you created in the tracking stage, whether you recorded it or you made it using some other means, and you combine all that together with processing to create the final stereo mix. Now this involves balancing the volumes of the different tracks. You might use automation to ensure that the tracks stay in balance or that certain parts come out at certain points, drop back in other points. You might use EQ, compression, effects such as reverb, delay, and so on, all to create that final mix. So to give you an example, I've got a mix from my EP Foundation here. You can see the individual tracks are up here. We've got the drums, bass, different solos, saxophone, organ, we've got horns, and so on. Each of those is on an individual track. It's just as it was recorded through the microphone or created using a keyboard or whatever the case may be. Down here at the bottom, we've got the mixer. And this is what actually combines all those tracks together to give us our stereo outputs that we hear through our headphones or through our speakers. So we use the sliders to adjust the volume levels. We might add delay to a particular track. Here's a delay plugin that's adding echo for us. We might add equalization. Here's an EQ plugin that we're using. And all of this is to get the tracks ready to combine them down to stereo so we can actually listen to them. So what you're hearing there are basically the raw tracks as they came in, and now I'm starting to work on those. As I said, I'm adding some EQ, I'm adding some effects, I'm adding some compression, doing some processing, doing some balancing to create that final mix. The third stage is the last stage of the audio production process, and this is where we're adding that final polish, doing the final tweaks and the final preparations for our files and our mixes so we can release them to the public. This would involve taking those final mixes that you've created in your DAW like this, whether they're stereo or multi-channel for surround, and doing processing on that overall stereo mix. So we're not working on the individual tracks. Those are all finished. We've put them off to the side. We have our final mix now, and we're going to do some final tweaks on that in the mastering stage. So we might take that stereo mix and we might EQ it a little bit because it needs a little bit more brightness overall, or a little less bass overall, so we can turn that down tonally, not bass instrument, but tonally frequency-wise, and adjust the EQ so that it's going to sound better no matter where it's heard. This is called transportability, being able to take a mix after it's been mastered and play it on any system and have it sound consistent. And it's also part of what makes a series of tracks in an album sound consistent as you go from track to track to track. You don't want them to sound wildly different tonally and level-wise. So mastering ensures that consistency. As I mentioned, this might mean EQ tweaks, but it also might mean limiting and compression to even out the dynamics. It might mean doing some stereo enhancement to increase the width of the mix or other enhancements as well. A big part of mastering, of course, is bringing the level up to the highest it can be while still sounding clean and not being distorted. Another aspect of mastering is creating all the different files you need for the different release formats. So the mastering engineer might create a stereo wave file for release on CD if you're still doing CDs. But it might also mean creating different MP3s and different lossless formats and things that you send out to streaming services, or that you release on your site or wherever you might be distributing your music. So all of that is handled by the mastering engineer, and there's more to it than just creating an MP3 of a wave file. Different file formats, different streaming services, different distribution networks, they all use different level references and things, so the mastering engineer ensures that what you send out is going to sound its very best no matter where it's heard. And that brings me to the final aspect of mastering I want to point out today, and that's objectivity. This is the reason that many musicians send their music off to be mastered separately by a separate mastering engineer, because they can listen with objective ears and not be so close to it that they're not hearing problems or not hearing what needs to be tweaked and fixed. So that objectivity can be a big part of mastering. One more thing I want to mention, and that's a term you may have heard, which is pre-mastering. And this means putting processing on the mixes that you're creating during the mixdown stage. You might add a little overall EQ, a little overall compression. There are a couple reasons to do this. Some engineers will use that final processing to actually process the mix and kind of glue it together is a term they use. But pre-mastering can also give you an idea of what your mix will sound like when it's actually mastered. And sometimes the balances and things can be affected by mastering, so by checking it with pre-mastering first, you get an idea of what's going to happen when it goes to its final mastering stage. To wrap things up today, I've got two examples to play for you. First, I'll play the raw mix of a song, the same song you heard earlier, and then I'll hear the actual mastered version that was done by Scott Hall in New York for me when the album was released. You can compare those two, compare the EQ, compare the levels, the compression, and so on, and hear what mastering really can do for a track. Now let's listen to the final mastered stereo mix. If you want to learn more about music and audio concepts like this, visit our news and research page at sweetwater.com or check out our glossary terms playlist.